So let's talk about Kenya, because that's the first doc I've decided to make about the Queen. So let's look at a map. We need a good map. So that's Kenya. It's a country east of Africa. Oh, in the east, within Africa. It's not east of Africa. There's a little region right here. It's called the White Highlands. Not white because they are physically white looking. They're white because this area has like some of the richest soil in the region. It's some of the best conditions in the world for coffee production. And it's called the White Highlands because a bunch of white people went there, where the settlers lived. They're having a good time over here. You had two tribes while this was happening called the Kikuyu and the Maasai. Now, the Kikuyu people kind of lived a way bit around here as well. They kind of inhabited most of the this highland area. And under the East African Protectorate, which would otherwise be known as the Kenya Crown Colony, the British helped the Maasai, who had lots of bad beef with the Kikuyu tribes, and basically utilized them to clear this whole area for the settlers to go. So the Kikuyus got fucked. They fled. They were scattered around Africa. Some went to the Middle East. This was in the 1800s. They wouldn't come back until the early 1900s or mid 1900s, kind of like 40s, 50s. They started to come back and they became very unruly, as you can imagine. They wanted their land back. They formed the Kikuyu Central Association. They did actually try. They exhausted all the peaceful options. They tried political solutions. Eventually, that did not work. They decided to form what was called the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, KFLA. There was little pockets of unrest. There was a chief who was very friendly to the British rulers who got murdered by them. And then in 1952, first of all, context. In the beginning of 1952, before the armed revolt, the Queen actually visits Kenya and does a little ceremony with the fucking troops or whatever, and then goes to like hang out in some tree house. If you've ever watched The Crown, where she's fucking about with elephants and shit. When she's there, her dad dies. She flies back because she has to go and get crowned queen. And that's the last she sees of Kenya. But about 8 or 9 months after that, there's a revolt in Kenya called the Mau Mau Uprising. Mau Mau is, no one really knows what that means. The British called it that. Non-arid means, arid is like desert, where you can't grow shit or anything. Arid is like dry, desolate bullshit, yeah. It's been suggested that Mau Mau is an anagram of Uma Uma, which is the Kenyan word for phrase for get out, or was spoken by the Kikuyu tribes. Who knows? But it starts with the stabbing with a white settler woman being stabbed to death, and then that triggers the revolt. The British massively overstated the guerrilla army of the rebellion and ordered this massive fucking clampdown. When I say overstated, it's because the guerrillas were armed with they had some machetes and knives, and if they were lucky, they had rifles and pistols. The British had 6 battalions. They had artillery, they had air power, the RAF was involved in this. Between 1953 and 55, the RAF dropped 6 million bombs on this area. Yeah. About 12,000 Black Africans were killed in the war, which lasted about 8 years, 52 to 1960. Most of them soldiers, contrasted to about 107 Europeans, 12 of whom were soldiers. 12 European soldiers killed to over 10,000 Black Africans. By 1952, the strategy of the British was very similar to that of like Lord Kitchener in South Africa, was scorched earth strategy, where they just decided to not only go after the soldiers and the fighters, but also all the families of the fighters as well. Anyone who they thought might be feeding the resistance, letting the resistance stay in their houses or for things like that. So because the guerrillas always moved around. And if the guerrillas are always moving around, they're depending on people to feed them, like farmers and shit like that. So every family that was accused of doing that was rounded up, and that was basically all of them. They were all rounded up into concentration camps, the Kenyan gulags, anything between 1 million and 1.5 million of them rounded up into camps, just because they were, there was a potential that they would be housing rebels and feeding them. About 50,000 of those people for those camps were military suspects. The rest were basically all civilians, women and children and all that shit. The conditions of these camps were fucking atrocious. There were buckets that people were given to piss and shit in that were left often right next to the drinking water containers. There were a couple of camps that were closed for medical epidemiological reasons. Because of this happened. No, this happened between 52 and 1960, before Kenyan independence. There was one camp that was designed to cram in 10,000 men. It eventually held 16,000, over 1,000 of whom had typhoid within the year. So 1 in 16 prisoners having typhoid, not to mention tuberculosis. Scurvy was endemic as well. There are a few orders that were actually given. In 1959, there was a camp of only 500 people where the people were very resistant in a peaceful way. There's no report of them violently resisting. There was one morning where they were asked to pick up spades and march for 1 mile to dig an irrigation ditch. 38 of them sat down and refused to move. The order given from a commandant called Sullivan was, it is assumed that the party would obey this order, but if they refused, they would be manhandled to the site of work and forced to carry out the task. Manhandled meaning, physically force them. The commandant took this as a green light to beat them repeatedly until 11 of them died and others were badly injured. This was in 1959, after the camps had been open for 7 years. That report finally made its way to the House of Commons, and an MP for Stoke-on-Trent addressed the Secretary of State for the Colonies and said, and actually asked this question, which is probably one of the weirdest questions I've ever heard. He asked, how many of the people who died of physical violence in the Hola camp were suffering from scurvy? And to what extent did the scurvy contribute to their deaths? The idea was that they wanted to blame the men who died for not eating properly. And that's why they died from the beatings. And that's what the Secretary of State for the Colonies said. He actually said, yeah, it looks like they died from scurvy. And then he went on to insist how we gave them all the right food, but we told them to eat alone, so it's very likely they weren't eating properly. And just all that mad shit. But one MP stood up. An MP for Wolverhampton stood up to Harold Macmillan's government. He was a Conservative MP. He said, we cannot say we will have African standards in Africa, Asian standards in Asia, and perhaps British standards here at home. We have not that choice to make. We must be consistent with ourselves everywhere. All government, all influence of man upon man rests on opinion. What we can do in Africa, where we can still govern and where we can no longer govern, depends upon the opinion which is entertained of the way in which this country acts and the way in which Englishmen act. We cannot, we dare not, in Africa of all places, fall below our own highest standards in the acceptance of responsibility. The guy who said that was Enoch Powell, who would later invite immigrants to plug holes in the health service and then give a speech about how the black man was eventually going to hold the whip hand over the white man. The Rivers of Blood speech. That was Enoch Powell standing up to his own government for having concentration camps in Kenya. People are weird. The result was that the camps closed. 2 senior officials overseeing those camps were forced to retire early. They got their pensions. That was about the level. That was about the level of accountability given there. And it seemed like from then on, though, the writing was on the wall for British imperialism. Even Macmillan himself, by the end of that decade, said, "The wind is the." He said, "Was this speech? The wind of change." He said, "The wind of change is blowing through this continent, Africa. Whether we like it or not, the growth of national consciousness is a political fact." Because this is when the surge of nationalism was becoming a thing, and independence movements were becoming just like uncontainable. Yeah. But those were the camps. Those were the Kenyan gulags in the early to late 1950s. It was called Operation Anvil. Was that plan to that was part of the getting people into the camps, was that they sealed off all the African inhabited areas of Nairobi. They actually labeled people in the camps with colors. They would call you a white, regardless of your skin color. They would call you a white if you cooperated with the captors. Some of those whites actually, some of those whites ended up becoming guards and interrogators in exchange for, not being abused. There were the Greys, who were suspected of swearing an oath to the Mau Mau uprising. If they were found guilty of it, they were hanged publicly in the camps. And the ones they labeled as the Blacks were the hardcore rebels. Well, yeah. They actually labeled a bunch of fucking black prisoners as black, grey, and white. So weird. The Red Cross wasn't allowed to inspect the camps until 1957. No one was given any prisoner of war status or anything like that. Yeah, and they just got away with that. And there you go. That's Kenya for you. That was probably the worst thing that Britain did in the final years of the empire. Pretty fucked. Thanks for the 200 bits, Dreadhead. Kev6, thanks for the tier 1 sub. Really appreciate that. Are you saying all this from the top of your head? No. I make Google Docs a lot and just kind of list. Yeah. Most of that, some of that's from Guardian articles. There's a lot. The Guardian writes a lot about British colonialism. Like, they have a lot of good pieces on it. And the stuff about the camps is from a book called British Concentration Camps. But yeah. Is this where I get really pissy and say, what the fuck was the Queen supposed to do? Did she even know? The fact that the MPs, a lot of them didn't know until like right at the end. And it was a Conservative MP who stood up and basically said, a very fucking racist Conservative MP who stood up and said we shouldn't do that. I don't know. Yeah, it was Powell. Yeah. It's the very ridiculous mind of the old school racist, you know? The insanity of these like white supremacists, because it's like it's the white supremacist who actually literally does love black people, but just as long as they don't live near us. Like that's how they think. Yeah. I don't think there's nothing inconsistent about Enoch Powell being the one to call out concentration camps in Kenya and then to 10 years later make a rivers of blood speech about immigration. Thanks, Rooked and Pawn Pill. Thanks for the 100 bits, powering up the hype train. True. The good kind of train. That's what we want in here. Yeah, I think that research deserves a bit of buck. Fuck you. I feel like we need to do a lot of Queen Elizabeth theory, you know, because of the all the shit that's going to go on. The discourse.
Remember the Holodomor?
The Queen should have marched in and denied the generals. Yeah, I think she, yeah. Well, she probably should have, you know, been briefed on it first. Can you imagine, like, the Queen sitting there eating her fucking eggs in the morning?
Because you...
On the back of a fucking slave, like, and then they're just like, Your Majesty, it is about Jew. We told you that we're abusing black people in Kenya. Is there anything else you'd like to know? And she's just like,
because you had...
do I have to do a speech? Okay. Crashtronomy. The 5 gifted tier 1 subs. Really appreciate that. Rooked and Pawn Pilled with a gifted tier 1 sub. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. I don't know what's going on. Okay. I imagine she knew bad things were going on in colonized countries, and whether she knew the details or not, I don't know. The fact that a lot of MPs didn't know about this stuff, I don't know. I think there's also the whitewashing is really powerful. Like even Churchill, back when he was like a journalist, was basically saying like, yeah, you know, it's just South Africa, these camps, you know, it's just a war, you know, we're treating them with the best possible humanity, and like, yeah, it's just people can be like, people are very, very in denial. Like, let's watch that Corbyn thing where Paxman asked him about the Queen. $33. Because Jeremy Corbyn was critical of the Queen like many, many times. He said her speech was a farce and shit. Like, for a fucking guy trying to become prime minister, that's not very easy, right? If you ever want to talk about early modern European colonization, I'm your guy. Thanks, I'm not this person. I'll keep it in mind. All right, Queen. Yeah, there was this. This bit is so fucking funny. Like, let's go from here just to see.
He's perfectly happy to sign off on more police officers and doubtless more money for MI5.
What you're going to see with John McDonnell is a chancellor that looks at the needs of the country, looks at the needs of the people of this country, and invests in our future, not hands money away in tax relief to big corporations and at the top end of our society.
This was like, it's still kind of amazing that he managed to do this, given his baggage for the British public. Like, he's everything the average British person hates. And he did so well with it.
There is nothing in this manifesto about getting rid of the monarchy, which is another thing you believe in, isn't it?
Look, there's nothing in there because we're not going to do it.
But you do believe in it, don't you?
Listen, it's not on anybody's agenda. It's certainly not on my agenda. And do you know what? I had a very nice chat with the Queen.
But you don't like her, do you? You don't like what she represents?
We got along absolutely fine, perfectly charming. But I don't think she should be brought into political discussion.
Any human being anywhere can have a nice conversation with anybody, but you do not believe in the institution of monarchy, do you?
Look, I believe in a democracy, and we live in a democracy. We have a titular head of state as the monarch, but
And
without
when
political
the
power.
Queen's reign comes to an end, should there be call stumps on the whole thing then? Call it a day.
Look, the law is there, and that's what will prevail. I'm fighting this election, Jeremy, on something very important.
Yeah,
that is the levels of poverty in our society, the levels of children that are not supported properly in our society.
This guy is supposed to be. Wait, where the fuck is his face? Where's this sneering, fucking melancholic horse head? Look, where? I want to fucking zoom in. Jeremy, the other Jeremy, where is he? Why is it so? Look at this. Look at this sneering, glaring, fucking horse head of death. He is supposed to be the ultimate debate bro of British media, like smacking his book. He just looked so powerless. He had nothing. This guy. He was like a hypochondriac, and Corbyn's just like really chill GP, like, mate, you're fine. What are you talking about? Can you imagine if Paxman asked him about the monarchy and Corbyn was like, she fucking committed genocide in Kenya and Syria, and she ordered the Royal Queen's Guard to mow down fucking dipshit protesters in Yemen, fucking bitch. Like, can you imagine if that was the response? What do you think would happen? What would have happened? Well, how the polling numbers have fared with that response? Would be cooler if Corbyn said yes with full chest. Good, yeah, that would have made you feel really happy. You know, you can soy out and shit, and then like, I don't know, Labour just fucking, yeah, the Conservatives would kept their majority in that election. Yeah,